As parents, we spend a lot of time thinking about our children's physical well-being, and that's a good thing to do. But today on Truth for Life, Alistair Begg reminds us that our top priority ought to be a focus on our entire family's spiritual health. Alistair draws these principles from the story of Jacob and his son Joseph, found in the book of Genesis.
The end of chapter 45 gives to us this amazing picture of the brothers heading back now to their father in Canaan with the carts and the clothes and the provisions and the donkeys and the prospect of having to greet their father and speak to him. They had been sent with a word of warning from their brother Joseph in verse 24 of chapter 45. Don't, he said, quarrel on the journey. He didn't want them to spend their time aggravating one another, and so they must have spent their time in some form of conversation. Doubtless, there would have been somebody who said, the thing that has struck me with such terror was when someone opened that bag of yours, Benjamin, and they pulled out the cup. And I knew in that instant we were in trouble. Yes, said to another of the brothers, but it was amazing. I could never in my wildest dreams have imagined that the Egyptian official would stand up to us and say those incredible words, I am Joseph. Yes, said someone, but what are we going to tell our father? How are we going to tell him? How are we going to tell him in a way that preserves us and encourages him? Because it's impossible for us to tell him that Joseph is alive without having to acknowledge the fact that we had lied and have lied over 20 years in an act of total deceit. And presumably they worked out some form of plan in some way that they could unfold the news to their dad that wouldn't find him dropping down dead. Now, as I read this section from the end of 45 all the way through to the end of actual chapter 47, and as I tried to wrestle with the broad sweep of time and personnel, I found myself thinking in terms of 4 scenes that if you were directing this, either as a stage play or as a movie, then these are scenes that you would definitely not want to miss. These are occasions when the camera angles are crucial, when you're using lenses that you can take the people in very close. You're not shooting from up on the hills or from vast distances. You're not using wide angles. You are actually focused on these 4 dramatic encounters. And it is to these 4 dramatic encounters that we're going to give our time this morning. First scene is at the end of chapter 45, in which Jacob's sons inform him that Joseph is still alive. The second scene to which we'll turn is at the beginning of chapter 46, in which Jacob sacrifices to God and is reassured in a vision. The third scene is in the region of verse 30 of chapter 46, in which Jacob meets his son Joseph and declares himself ready to die. And then the final scene to which we'll turn is around verse 12 of chapter 47, in which we have, interestingly, the patriarch Jacob blessing Pharaoh, the man who's in charge of the totality of Egypt. And as I went through all of this, the recurring phrase that was in my mind was, there are places I'll remember all my life. Though some have changed, some for good and some for better, some have gone and some remain. And each of us have such places. And they are points either to remind us of the gravity of our sin and thereby humble us, and or the immensity of God's grace and thereby pick us up. But each of us have these places. And certainly Jacob too. So let me give them to you, and I'm going to summarize each scene under one word. And the first word is stunned. Stunned. Because that is exactly what Jacob was at the end of chapter 45. Indeed, we're told that when they arrived and spoke to him in this way, Jacob was absolutely stunned. Now, the brothers had been dispatched by Joseph with the directive in verse 9 of chapter 45 Now hurry back to my father and say to him, this is what your son Joseph has said, says, God has made me Lord of all Egypt. So they were in no doubt as to what they were supposed to do. Go back, get their father, and tell them this. Jacob, here's the deal. Joseph is alive, and he is the Lord of all Egypt. Now, presumably, there was some kind of preamble which led up to this, which is not recorded for us in the Scripture. Presumably, they didn't blurt it out, although that is distinctly a possibility. But they got to it. And as they speak these words, two things to notice. Number one, Jacob was confused by what he heard. He was confused by what he heard. Because what he heard was, Joseph is alive. Now, if you had met Jacob in a bazaar somewhere, and he was sitting there having coffee, and you said, you're an old man, tell me some of the things you've seen, and tell me some of the joys and sorrows of your life, there is no question that he would have described with great passion and detail the day that he sent away his 17-year-old son to find his other sons in the region of Dothan. And he would have been able to describe with all the passion of a father's heart how, when he said goodbye to Joseph, he anticipated that he would be back before too long. How, in waving goodbye to him and recognizing the apparent dangers that were represented in his boy making a journey like this, he had watched him go off into the distance. And perhaps had stood and waved, and his boy had turned back and waved, and especially if there was a vast open terrain, they would have been able to wave to one another until just that point where you go over the horizon. If you ever have done it on in a railway station, you know, for example, in British Rail, many of the platforms are very long. The trains start off slowly, and you can wave and wave and wave until one of two things happens. Either you get your head knocked off by a signal box, or the train track turns and you go around the corner, and as soon as you go around the corner, it's all over. You can stand and look if you wish, but you'll never see their face again, at least not now. And Jacob had stood and watched his boy go there. And then he'd waited for him to come. And he had never come. And instead, what had happened was that his brothers had returned, and they had returned carrying the lovely coat that Jacob had given his boy, covered in blood and mangled, apparently, as a result of the activities of a ferocious beast. And Jacob had been absolutely devastated as he fell on the ground, grabbed big clods of dust, threw them in his hair as a symbol of his absolute terror and tragedy at the loss of his prized boy. And now, these same characters who had brought to him some 22 years ago the bloodied coat are standing in front of him saying, your son, Joseph, he's alive. So he was confused by what he heard, because 22 years of his absence had convinced him of one thing: Joseph was dead. And now, into the mainframe of his computer is inserted the information from this disk, and it does not jibe. He cannot make sense of it. The images of Joseph's going are fixed in his mind, and as he tries to process this, it just does not make sense. It is total confusion. If they'd come to him and said, Abraham has risen from the dead, or Isaac is alive from the dead, it wouldn't have been any more stunning to him than this information. And they add another unbelievable layer to the story. They said not only is he alive, but he is the ruler of all Egypt. Your boy is alive, and he's the prime minister of Egypt. Now just try and get under the story for a little minute. One, you think your boy's dead, then you find out he's alive, and then you find out that he's actually living in the big house. And he's in charge of the whole operation. 1 minute, you're picked up wanting to believe it on the wave of a great optimism. And the next minute, you're caught in the undertow as you're dragged down. You said, this can't possibly be true. I don't know what to believe from these kids anymore. I don't know when they're telling me the truth and when they're not. I don't know if they were lying then or they're lying now. And so they tell him the story. And as they tell him the story, presumably using the words of Joseph very much, how Joseph had been compassionate and forgiving in the hope that their father Jacob would follow suit, Jacob listens. And what he hears is then combined with what he saw. And if he was confused by what he heard, then secondly, notice that he was convinced by what he saw. Because he saw the carts that Joseph had sent to carry him back. You say, well, that's not much, is it? Seeing a few carts? What would that mean? Well, he knew that they didn't have these carts. He knew they got them somewhere. And he then had to presumably determine that they had gathered up all these carts so that they could come up with this elaborate hoax. And why would they possibly do that? Furthermore, these carts weren't Canaanite carts. The steering wheels were on the wrong side, if you like. They weren't the usual thing. They were marked in a certain way, or the wheel arches were different, or there was something that said, these are not Canaanite carts. And he suddenly says, you know what? I think they're telling me the truth. This is an elaborate story. My heart is absolutely breaking as I try and receive it. I can't hope to believe it all, and yet I must believe it all. And then he says, okay, then he says, I'm convinced my son Joseph is alive. I'm going to go and see him. My son Joseph is alive. Now, I want to just stop here for a moment and say that this ought to be the great longing of every father's heart in relationship to his boys and his girls. Because the real aliveness that we long for in our children is not the aliveness of physical life, for which we're thankful and which we enjoy in the interaction of our daily pilgrimage, but the great aliveness for which we long is the aliveness of spiritual life. You see, because Jacob and Joseph could hang out together for a while as they did, they could enjoy that, but both Jacob and Joseph were going to die. And fathers and sons and fathers and daughters can go to picnics and parties and stroll and talk and listen to music and read books and take trips and do everything, but father and daughter and father and son will all die. And unless there is spiritual life in both father and children, then the prospect of life is so gloomy, so empty. And these transient elements of our days cannot begin to counter the balance for the deadness of spiritual emptiness in the lives of those who are our own. You see, your mind rushes forward, does it not, to Luke 15 and the words of another father in the story of Jesus. This my son was dead, and he's alive again. He was lost. Now he's found. And the stunned experience of Jacob in the anticipation of the reunion with his son, because whom he regarded as dead is now alive, is nothing to be compared with the joy and the reality and the immensity of a father being able to rejoice in the spiritual life of his children. You see, because when a sinner is brought back from his wanderings to God, then he or she is alive from the worst kind of death. On the Discovery Channel, there was a thing on cryonics, or whatever you call that, about freezing people and hoping that you can get them back out of their frozen state when you discover the answer to life and so on. And it was a matter of some discussion between myself and my daughters. And I was explaining to them, this is an irrelevancy, you understand. No one has spoken one word about a soul. No one has acknowledged the fact that God has placed within the framework of man this great issue. And these poor, wretched people hoping that they might live forever, never giving a thought to the fact that the great death with which to deal is spiritual death. And that men and women live dead in their trespasses and in their sins. And that spiritual death combined with physical death equals eternal death, which the Bible calls hell. And therefore the great need for aliveness is to be made alive spiritually so that when we die physically, we may then live eternally. I'm convinced my son is alive. That is the great longing of every Christian father's heart. There's not a business deal can compensate for that. There's not a vacation. There's nothing can compensate for that. I'm not talking in the wind, loved ones. Now let's move the trolleys, the wheels, the apparatus, and go on to scene 2. Chapter 46, we stop at a place called Beersheba. I'm sure if we could hear them say it, they would say it a little better than this. I'm sure the anglicized version of it just doesn't come out right. Anyway, it was a significant place. It was a significant place in Jacob's family. If you go back to chapter 21 at your leisure, you'll find that Abram had planted a tamarisk tree there, and he'd called on the name of the Lord. That was his grandfather. His father Isaac had also had his servants dig a well there. He'd pitched his tent there. He'd built an altar there, and he'd called on the name of the Lord. And so, on his journey, Jacob stops purposefully at this point. This is a place of stopping. And they stop deliberately and purposefully, and in stopping here, notice 2 things. One, the attitude that he revealed. The attitude that he revealed. In offering sacrifices to God, he revealed the fact that he knew himself to be a sinner in need of pardon. Every time the patriarchs offer these sacrifices, they are acknowledging their sense of the demerit of their offenses, and they are acknowledging their hope of forgiveness through this better sacrifice which would one day come, which of course we know to be the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. And so he stopped, and he looked back down through the corridor of time. There was certainly much for which he needed to be forgiven, and he offers sacrifice to God as an expression and a pledge of his obedience. His attitude is that of a sinner in need of pardon. His attitude is that of a worshiper before the only true God. Why are you doing this? The others must have asked. Why are we stopping here? Don't you think we should hasten on? Aren't you excited to see your boy Joseph? Goodness gracious, of course he was. Why did he stop? Because he was a worshiper. And worshipers worship. They don't worship because the bell rings. They don't worship because the trumpet sounds. They don't worship because someone stands up in the prayer tower and says, now it's time to turn east. The kind of worshipers the Father seeks are those who worship in spirit and in truth. And Jacob worshipped. His attitude was that of a sinner in need of pardon, a worshiper before the only true God, and a pilgrim in need of guidance. A pilgrim in need of guidance. What is all this business here where God comes and speaks to him to assure him? Well, you need to read back in the story and again at your leisure. But in Genesis 26, Isaac had God appear to him in a vision. And God said, do not go down to Egypt and live in the land that I give you. And so Jacob, in the awareness of that, was concerned lest his desire to be reunited with his boy should put him in a place of disobedience. Interesting concern, is it not? In other words, that his passion and his compassion in relationship to the concerns of family affection were to be in the life of Jacob subservient to the clear mandate of God. Now, unless that's too much of a mouthful, let me pause and unpack it for you for just a moment. This is what Jacob is affirming here. That no matter how excited he was about seeing Joseph, no matter how much that meant to him in terms of his earthly pilgrimage, a good conscience towards God was ultimately more important to Jacob than ever seeing his son again. In other words, you see, he allowed eternity so to fill his mind that time took its place where it should. Rather than they had allowed time so to fill his perspective that eternity had to fight for a place. How does this come out in our time? It comes out in this way at least. That when the call of God comes to us and says, now listen, we want you to take all that you have. We want to take your bachelor's degree at Case Western Reserve University and your master's degree from Chicago and your master's degree in theology from Columbia. We want to take all your musical ability and all of your talent and all of your expertise as a couple, and we want you to go and bury yourself in Macedonia for the sake of the gospel. But what about my mom and dad? What about my brothers and my sisters? What about this? And what about that? And what about the next? Here's the issue. The issue of obedience to God takes precedence over the matters of family affection. Now, obedience to God does not set family affection in opposition to His obedience. It simply puts it in its place. And I believe in these days that God is speaking to people in our congregation, young individuals, people in their middle years, saying, you know what? You've done pretty well. You're set. Now I want you to get up from your settled position. You're financially secure. You're looking at the rest of your life. What are you planning on doing? Just kind of sitting around? Are you prepared to give up your small ambitions? And are you prepared to go for God wherever He says, whenever He tells you, to do whatever He wants in the cause of the gospel in the light of eternity? And the response comes, well, you know, I got a lot of things here. I've got my family. I've got this. I've got that. I've got that. God understands all of that. He doesn't ask us to go in obedience to Him, somehow to denigrate that, but in order to put it in its place. And Jacob reveals that.
You're listening to Truth for Life and a message from a series titled The Hand of God. Jacob set a great example of faithful obedience, how to keep God first in our homes and our decision-making. And when we do that, what we leave is a godly legacy for our children and our grandchildren. To help you in that goal, we've got a resource we'd like to send you. It's a book titled A Good Old Age. It's written by Alistair's friend and mentor, Derek Prime. This book walks through 26 character qualities that are pleasing to God. And Derek explains how, through God's power, we can live these virtues out, especially as we encounter challenges that come with getting older. It's never too late to leave a legacy of godliness, and you'll benefit from this book no matter what stage of life you're in. We'd love to have you request a copy of the book today. It comes to you as our way of saying thank you for your support of this ministry. Truth for Life is 100% listener-funded, which means that when you give, your donation goes directly to bringing Alistair's teaching to others. In a world where truth is more and more seen as relative, the Bible truly is our anchor. It orients our priorities and our everyday decisions. The Bible, in the hands of the Holy Spirit, changes lives. And that's what we mean when we say that the learning really is for living. We had a listener named Mike who put it really well recently when he got in touch with us. I want you to hear his comments.
Well, one of the things I've always appreciated about Alistair's ministry is that he preaches the gospel with every single sermon. He has an incredible way of connecting the gospel to someone personally. And whenever I listen to him now, I feel like he's speaking to me, to my problems and my issues and to my sinfulness, and it's very convicting. So it's not topical talk by someone off the cuff. It's very simple, plain teaching through the books of the Bible, and that's something that I need as a Christian, to be fed on the gospel.
Will you help keep these messages available on the radio and on the web so that more lives can be changed by the teaching of God's Word? Because as we close our books on 2018 at the end of this month, your gift is needed to help us end in a positive position. You can make a generous year-end donation right now when you call 888-588-7884. And don't forget to ask for a copy of the book titled A Good Old Age. The number again is 888-588-7884, or give and request the book online at truthforlife.org. I'm Bob Lepine. Tomorrow we'll learn more about honoring God in our families as Alistair concludes this message titled A Pilgrim's Progress. This daily program features the Bible teaching of Alistair Begg, and it's furnished by Truth for Life, where the learning is for living.